So, in the fantasy writing space, there are many people who seem to be world builders first and writers second. I mean, it's only to be expected with this kind of speculative fiction, you know? You're essentially imagining what the world would be like if magic existed, or if it was created by 7 elemental primordial gods, or if it was a flat disc balanced on the backs of 4 elephants, who are in turn balanced on the back of a giant turtle, or whatever you want, really. It's a fun thought exercise. It's probably a huge part of what draws people to writing fantasy in the first place. These people make complete and total sense to me, and I honestly don't think there's anything wrong with them at all. In fact, in a lot of ways, I envy them, because I am not among them. I am a writer first, world builder third. Writer, artist, world builder. That's how the hierarchy goes for me. I'm not really a very good world builder. I can come up with a decent magic system, but honestly, in my opinion, that's like the easiest part of world building. The hard parts, culture, geography, history, flora and fauna, and the most important of all, yet most difficult to grasp, whimsy, are all very lacking in my world building because I am lazy. Like I said, I'm a writer first and a world builder third. I like my characters and I want to write about them. I'm passionate about my themes and the meaning of my work, and I want to write about that. Those things are what get me excited about writing, not world building. If you're watching this as one of those world builder extraordinaires I mentioned, you may be wondering, why am I even writing fantasy if I'm not that into world building then? And for that, I do have 3 reasons. Number 1, fantasy is what I like to read and watch, so it's also what I like to write. I write what I like. Number 2, I actually do like world building in theory, I'm just bad at it because I have the very specific and highly cursed kind of ADHD that makes it very difficult for me to learn things outside of a school environment, making research a huge pain in the butt. And number 3, speculative fiction can be just as much a tool as it is a genre, or a collection of genres anyhow. Think about C.S. Lewis with The Chronicles of Narnia, which was basically written as a biblical allegory, or the way that Hiromu Arakawa used the fictional setting of Fullmetal Alchemist to criticize militarism, imperialism, and authoritarianism. Sometimes the story you want to tell is best told through a world that isn't our own. Sometimes it just doesn't fit here and you have to put it somewhere else in order for it to properly unfold. People are often the most willing to consider and accept certain ideas when communicated through the lens of fiction, and fantasy doesn't just fictionalize the events in the way of realistic or historical fiction. It fictionalizes the entire world in which these events take place, making it an incredibly powerful tool. My story is definitely one of those aforementioned ones that doesn't belong in the real world. It's too big and too specific and too opinionated, for lack of a better word. And by neglecting my world building, I was neglecting my story itself. The characters, the plot, and the themes. I've said this before in a previous video, but it's really hard to write an interesting story in a boring world. And it's almost impossible to write a thematically coherent story in an incoherent world. So, without any further ado, welcome to episode 1 of Fixing My Fantasy Map, the series in which I do exactly as the title suggests. But before I fix my fantasy map, it stands to reason that I should explain what was wrong with it in the first place. I'll be focusing today on the continent of Nordestil, or Fantasy Europe, and the country of Septent, where the story mainly takes place. But here is a horrible, crunchy JPEG of the whole world for reference. Yeah, so if you have a keen eye, I'm sure you can already see some of the problems here. The continents don't really seem to fit together, especially this one to the west here. It's just kind of there. This is because I did not do a plate tectonics map or really study the real world at all. Now, this may be a bit of an unpopular opinion, and I may draw some backlash for it, but I don't really consider a detailed understanding of your world's plate tectonics to be strictly necessary for fantasy mapmaking, even in a more low-ish fantasy setting like mine. I mean, the supposed rule of mountains exist along fault lines is broken all the time in real life. If the Appalachian Mountains get to exist literal thousands of miles from any fault line, then I can put my mountains wherever the hell I please, thank you very much. I will, however, be putting much more care into making sure that my landmasses fit together on my new map and taking into account the existence of tectonic plates, even though I will not be making a fully fleshed out tectonic map, because that is too much work for something that is basically a first draft for me. Anyway, the problems with this map get even more glaring when I zoom in. Here are some very low-quality maps of Nordestil that I drew 1 year ago when I was getting ready to share my story as a webcomic, an endeavor which sadly did not work out for me. On the left here is the political map, and on the right is the physical map. This huge blue swath is Septent. If you look here at the physical map, you'll see that Septent's territory largely cuts off at the northern bank of this huge river called the Morentasquivo, or colloquially, the Scar. You will notice that the majority of its coastal regions are fairly mountainous, with a large, much flatter area in the middle of it all. What you will not notice, because I never bothered to draw a biome map, is that this whole area that I have outlined in green is covered with very thick, very wild, very dangerous forest. This is a major plot point in the story because Septent is supposed to be an industrial European empire. They want to expand both their power and their resources, and in theory are already rich in land and natural resources, but are struggling to expand due to the overwhelming impassability of this forest. All of their infrastructure is built around it, as they rely on boat and train travel to get between cities, and their economy is fueled almost entirely by trade. There is a huge focus in Septentrian politics not just on expanding the imperial power outside of its borders, but also within. None of that is necessarily the problem with Septent and Nordistil's world building. The actual first problem is that, realistically, a country like Septent should not exist. Let's think about this practically. Septent's capital city of Monchivit is up here. Considering how close this is to the North Pole, which is what that squiggly line up there is, it should be cold as balls up here, and there's no water source anywhere nearby. Where are they getting their food? Where are they getting their water? This is not a good location to support a large urban population. And then, here are the locations of all of their major cities. Their biggest port city is Mabe Port, which you would think is at a fine location, except for the fact that Septent's biggest allies and trade partners are all on the opposite side of the continent. And these cities are all spaced super far apart. While Septent has trains now, it certainly hasn't had them for the thousands of years that the country was supposed to have existed for. How would they have gotten supplies between all of these cities before they had trains? The infrastructure must have been a nightmare. Septent should not be as big as it is, basically, and Monchivit should not be the dominant cultural center of it because there is no way it could possibly support a big enough population. If all of these cities are supposed to have existed since this world's equivalent of medieval times, then people in Mabe Port shouldn't even speak the same language as people in Monchivit. None of this geography makes any goddamn sense, basically. This flatter, fertile area over here should be way more populated than it is. Their major port city should be over here. But no, I thought, it's a rural area. They won't have a big population density, based on my knowledge of how American geography works, while ignoring that American geography is the way it is because it was largely settled in an industrial or post-industrial, post-scientific revolution age. People will live where there is food for them to eat, and when you don't have speedy shipping infrastructure to get large quantities of food and water from point A to point B, then people are going to settle where the food grows and where the water flows. That was one of my main issues with Septent's world building. The other main issue is that, culturally speaking, this place is a mess. My original intention with Septent was to base it on the British Empire, specifically during the late Victorian era. I wanted to criticize the notions of class and race-based superiority that were so rampant during that time, the social Darwinism and jingoism of it all. Why, you ask? Well, because I saw parallels between that mindset and the imperialist mindset held by the United States throughout the settling of the West and the Cold War, and even today, if we're being even a tiny bit honest with ourselves. Basically, I wanted to criticize my own country by criticizing another country by creating a parallel for that country in my fantasy world. Yeah. So that wasn't exactly the most intelligent of ideas, I am willing to admit, but I was also 15 when I first thought of it, so if you wouldn't mind cutting me just a little bit of slack on that, I would appreciate it very much, thank you. And, clearly, I am not, in fact, British, but American. I don't have any personal experience with the actions of the UK, and I don't follow their politics very closely either, because I don't live there. It doesn't directly affect me, and frankly, following my own country's politics is enough of a task. Naturally, as someone who has lived in America my whole life, who is old enough to perceive the events that transpire around me and understand to a degree the effects that the past has on the present, I have opinions about my country, and they are much stronger opinions than any I might have on the UK. Therefore, I started absent-mindedly implementing features of my own country's culture or politics or foreign policy into Septent, and then trying to make the country remain coherent with itself both as a fictional nation and as a tool of my narrative. For example, everyone in Monchivit speaks with an English accent. The rich people from there are posh, and everyone else just has whatever regional accent I feel like. However, the accent of Mabe Port is literally just a stereotypical New York accent. Mabe Port is just fantasy New York City. This city up here, Verdem, is Chicago. It's just Chicago. Part of the reason why I didn't want to commit to basing my setting on the US is because I felt like my country had too much historical baggage for me to feel comfortable portraying it so directly. I was scared that I would accidentally portray a glorified or oversimplified version of my country, or accidentally do a racism or something. But honestly, that's total BS. It's not that my country doesn't have a huge amount of bloody history, or that I shouldn't be careful with how I portray those parallels in my fantasy world, but, like, the British Empire famously is just as full of bloody history, if not more, due to having existed for longer, and it's not even my bloody history. I have complex feelings about my country that I want to communicate and explore through my story, and I'm not going to get that done by basing my setting primarily on a different country that I've never even visited. Therefore, the first parts of my world building that need a major overhaul are Septent and its relationship to the continent of Nordestil.
So, with all of that explanation of why I want the country my story takes place in to be based on America and not the UK, let me clarify that I do not want a one-to-one parallel. One-to-one parallels are boring, and frankly, there are still some things in the history of the United States that I don't want to touch, mainly because I don't think I have anything productive to say about them. The history of my fantasy country will therefore be very different from the United States, despite sharing many intentional similarities, both because of how the absence of the topics I do not wish to cover would change the course of events, and because I am writing fantasy and not speculative history. The first thing I figured I ought to do is change the shapes of the land masses on my map. It doesn't make any sense for a country based on the US to exist on the same continent as a bunch that are based on Europe without some kind of major geographical divide. However, I also wanted to keep the aristocratic governmental system from the old version of Septent because it is highly relevant to the plot of the story and the motivations of like half of the main characters. I'll get into the new and improved history that goes along with this map later, though. I was going to try to explain it in tandem with the map, but I ended up with a mile-long tangent about the Protestant Reformation, and while history is important and fun, I want this video to be about my map, and also to be less than an hour long. So, without any further commentary, here is my new map of this continent. The landmass to the west here is Septent, and the landmass to the east is Nordestil. The mass that has Septent on it is on the other side of a highly active convergent fault line from Nordestil, which means a lot of earthquakes, and, because on a geological scale it has only recently connected with the Nordestilian continent, means some very young and very, very high mountains here. These mountains are up to 23,000 feet in some areas, as you can see from the handy elevation map I have provided, so they are rendered extremely dangerous and very much not worth the effort of crossing on foot.
You can see that I've only bothered to draw an elevation map of Septent so far, which is because I am saving Nordestil's map for another day, as it's on a somewhat lower priority level than Septent's. Septent's geography obviously is based quite heavily on that of the US, because the country itself is going to be based on the US, and because I think that the US has a lot of very cool and interesting biomes that ought to be adapted into fantasy more often. Like, seriously, we have to get more creative with our fantasy settings. This skinny mountain range in the far west here is based on the Cascades, and this higher, bigger range is based on the Rockies. Going east, this more vertical range is based heavily on the Appalachians, and this more horizontal one is not based on any real mountain range. I just thought, as someone who has spent basically my entire life on the west coast of the real United States, that the eastern half of the country is too flat and needed some more diversity in its elevation. Sorry to anyone that lives there that was probably hugely offended by that statement. I'm very biased. It was also in an effort to justify adding more biomes to the eastern region, because the characters probably won't be exploring the western region of the continent in the story, and as someone who has been through the Great Plains before, it gets just a teensy bit dull after the first, 500 or so miles of golden hills that remind you eerily of the ocean because of how far they stretch in every conceivable direction. Admittedly, I did not flesh out these northern islands very well at all, which I am mostly okay with because they are largely in the Arctic, so there won't be a lot of settlement on them anyway. This, of course, means that a lot of Nordestil will also be Arctic, which I don't really want, so I will fix these continents' alignment on my map later, and maybe flesh out the northern islands more, but for now, they're just gonna be flat, empty, and covered in ice. Now, moving on to my biomes. My biome map is a tad bit messy, but the western half here is once again based heavily on the western half of the US. While I am the most familiar with the western US due to living there, and I think it has an absolutely breathtaking array of beautiful and fascinating landscapes, I won't go as in-depth on this region because, again, the characters probably won't be exploring it, so it's less relevant to the story. The rich, cool green represents coniferous evergreen forest. The more medium green is mixed forests. The lightish, warm green is just regular temperate grassland, kind of like a placeholder biome for me because I was a bit lazy. The very pale green scattered throughout the landscape represents highlands, of which there are a lot in the western United States and just like in general. This yellowy beige is desert, the muddy blue-green is swamps and marshes, and the darker blue-green is mangroves, and lastly, the gray bits in the landscape represent the harsh, rocky peaks of some of the higher mountains. On the eastern side of our Rocky Mountain equivalents, we have a lot more broadleaf and mixed forests, which are represented by this medium green and this yellower green here. We also have two other kinds of forest biome, including quite a bit of boreal forest up here, because this whole northeastern area is like way more north than the northern US is, and what I've chosen to call a mixed woodlock forest. Woodlock forest is basically just like a super dense old-growth forest that has remained largely untampered with by the Nordestilian settlers due to how difficult and dangerous it is to traverse. There's also some stuff that has to do with magic in there, but I don't feel like explaining my magic system right now, so we're just gonna... It's a fancy, unique old-growth forest that's hard to get through. It's the giant forest that Septon had to build all of its infrastructure around in the previous versions. You'll notice that I placed it over my equivalent to the Appalachian Mountains, and that was highly intentional. In fact, it was something that I debated with myself for a while. I either wanted to base this forest on the temperate rainforests and redwood forests of the West Coast, which I am more familiar with and I honestly think would make a great setting for a spooky wild forest a la Gravity Falls, or on the infamously haunted, if you believe in that kind of thing, Appalachian Woods. Initially, I was just going to go with the latter for the reasons of this area being more based on the eastern US and Appalachian folklore being, in my opinion, way more creepy and unsettling than Pacific Northwest folklore, but then I remembered that this is my fake world and I can do whatever I want with it. And also, I already put a desert in this region anyway, where there aren't any in the real eastern US, so I figured I would just combine the two because I already sacrificed the one-to-one parallelism that I'm supposedly trying to avoid anyway. The northern half of this woodlock forest is much more coniferous, with some patches of giant redwoods like the forests on the west coast, and the southern half is more predominantly deciduous and more resembles the Appalachian forests. Anyway, onto the rest of the biomes in this area. I felt the need to do some extra explaining of the woodlock forests because they are like super important to the story. The characters spend a lot of time in them. The pale, cool green north of the boreal forests is tundra, and there are some swamps, highlands, and a little bit of desert interspersed with everything else on this half of the continent. The swamp in the far eastern area over here is meant to be based on the Florida Everglades. And this little bit of desert is there because I was mourning that if my story was set in the eastern area, my characters wouldn't get to travel through anything like the extremely awesome deserts of the southeastern US, so I plonked it down in an area with fewer water sources. That about sums up everything I have to say about my biomes for this video, which means that we can move on to my favorite part, the cities. This here is Cradle, which was formerly known as Montchivit and is the capital of Septont, a country that I will probably also have to change the name of eventually. I just didn't feel like it right now. Cradle is not based on any particular real-world city, but I am keeping the detail that most people there have English accents because it would have been settled earlier than most of the other major cities, and the dominant social class there is the nobility, who cling fiercely to their Nordestilian roots as a way of displaying a sense of superiority. Which is one way in which the culture of this fictional country is very different from the US, as in the early US, the government wanted very much to distinguish itself from the European powers and nobility. The city got its name because Nordestilian settlers landed on the continent in, let's just say, less than ideal circumstances. I'll probably get into why that is in a future video because this script is getting kind of long, and I don't think that there are very many people in the world who want to watch a 1 hour long video about some nobody's unfinished world building. Basically, Cradle is situated on fertile ground in the crook of the Boreas River, which is this river coming down from the north here, making it the first really viable location they found to put down a lasting settlement. This is probably a really stupid name, and I will probably change it later to something else with a similar meaning, but less stupid sound. Next up is Verdem, which used to be based on Chicago, but I am changing it to be based on nothing in particular once again. It became a successful city because the river valley between these two mountain ranges is super fertile and generally quite pleasant in terms of climate. Moving west, we have Swallow City, formerly Mabe Port. It is going to be based heavily on New York City, with maybe a little bit of influence from New Orleans as well, and it got its name because the gulf that it is at the back end of is known as the Maw Gulf, due to looking kind of like the gaping jaws of the continent, and Swallow City is right where the throat would be if you went along with this metaphor. It's also the country's biggest commercial city and its most populated one, so plenty of things enter the country and are thus swallowed by it from its port. This city east of Swallow City here I haven't named, but I imagine it would be nicknamed The Tooth, or something like that in the way that New York is often nicknamed the Big Apple. It is also a huge port city, but it's not as big in population as Swallow City because it's built on a swamp and there's a lot less room for food production in a swamp than there is in a non-swampy valley like where Swallow City is situated. St. Marine up here is fantasy Chicago. There is not much more to it. You see, as somebody who has never been to Chicago in my life, I am afflicted with a very strange and completely inexplicable case of Chicago-related brain rot, and this is my outlet for that. Like Chicago, St. Marine got to be a hugely important commercial city because of its very convenient location on a Great Lake, which is connected to a bunch of rivers, which are in turn connected to a bunch of other cities, making it an important industrial shipping hub. It blew up semi-recently due to the invention of trains and steam-powered ships and whatnot. Wayport is in kind of a similar situation, but it's in much more of a railway hub than a river hub. Most of these other red dots that represent major cities also blew up recently as a result of the invention of rail. They are basically checkpoints that sprung up along rail lines in particularly lucrative areas. Speaking of, here is a map of the country's major train lines. You can see that the western half is much more interconnected than the eastern half, and this is because of the woodlock forests, which the country has kind of had to build its tracks around. It's also why there are so few cities along these huge rivers here. Anyhow, this has been me fixing my world building for the country formerly known as Septent, new name pending, that is kind of the main setting for my fantasy story. I'm talking off script right now, hopefully you can hear me over the sound of my fan. I am not entirely proud of everything that I've done in this video, but it's definitely a good start when it comes to fixing my world building, and if it comes down to it, later on I can definitely, make another video where I fix it some more, but I think this is a good start, and I feel a lot better about it than I did about my old world building because it feels a lot more authentic to me and the story that I want to tell than my old world building did. So yeah, tune in again in an unknowable amount of time for either a yap ramble video about one of my characters or another world building video either about the history of the country formerly known as Septent or the new and improved map of the continent of Nordestill. Bye bye.